Hello, NaNoWriMo. I'm Grant Faulkner, Executive Director of NaNoWriMo, and I'm getting this little sign that says we're live. So we're live. Welcome to this webcast on editing. I am excited about it because I'm in the same position that most of you might be in as well. You've written a rough draft during November. You locked up your internet editor. You wrote with abandon. You hit 50,000 words. And now the question is, what do you do with what I call a glorious mess of words? But sometimes I'm a little nervous to open up my NaNoWriMo document just because I'm worried. I'm worried that it's going to be too messy for me to even kind of consider dealing with it. But trust me, you will find wonderful gems, wonderful sentences, wonderful storylines. Wonderful novel possibilities. And you can bring some of that same spirit that you brought to your 50,000 words to revision. I was looking at my NaNoWriMo mug here, which has NaNoWriMo is bottomless bit bravery. You will need that for revision. It's NaNoWriMo is an inspiration elixir. Trust me, you'll become more inspired by your novel the deeper you go into it with revision. You get noveling fuel, of course. It's a perseverance potion in here. So trust all of those energies that you put into your novel in the rough draft in November, and just put them in a different way in revision. Maybe you got to let the inner editor out, obviously, and maybe write just a little more slowly. So anyway, we're gonna go over a lot of great editing techniques, and I want to thank AutoCrit for sponsoring this webcast. And just in case you don't know what AutoCrit is, it is an editing platform that leverages algorithms to analyze your prose and provide instant genre-specific feedback. We're going to actually do a demo later on in the webcast, and do a walkthrough of actually a NaNoWriMo writer's manuscript, and then kind of show how the whole software works. And that'll take about 10 or 15 minutes or so. And also wanted to let you know that AutoCrit is running a contest and giving away free AutoCrit memberships to lucky participants on the webcast. So I think Catherine is going to put in that link in the chat window so people can click on it and check out all the details. But it is autocrit.com/NaNoWriMo if you want to check it out. And we'll tell more about that later on in the podcast as well. First, though, I want to welcome our special guest, Ally Machate, who also goes by Ally. And Ally published her first piece of writing in Creative Kids magazine way back when she was 9 years old. Yes, she was one of those people who was destined to be a writer. Unfortunately, she pursued that passion. She's gone on to write novels in several different NaNoWriMo, so she's a seasoned NaNoWriMo veteran. And she's also revised and published her own books, and she's helped best-selling indie authors and clients publish with companies such as Simon & Schuster, Penguin, Random House Chronicle Books, and many more. Thanks for joining us, Ally.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm so excited.
Yeah, and Ally made this heroic drive through a snowstorm on the East Coast after planes were canceled to come here. So anyway, there was drama. Roads. So yeah, and she's got plenty of great revision tips. And just so you know, I'm going to talk with Ally for about 20 or 25 minutes about revision, and then we're going to do a brief demo of AutoCrit. And please put your questions in the chat window. Catherine, our producer, will give them to me, and we'll ask Ally, and we'll have a great discussion. So thanks so much for joining us. Well, Ally, just to get a sense of who you are as a writer, can you tell us a little bit about your writing journey, and especially how you did NaNoWriMo, what it meant to you? Are you a planner or a pantser? How do you go about completing a rough draft?
Yeah. Well, like you said, Grant, I've been writing since a very young age, mostly because I love to read. I love books. It started there, I think, as it does for most of us. And I just started writing, and I continued doing that in a number of different ways all through grade school and high school and college. I was very fortunate to get a job out of college at Simon & Schuster, where I worked for many years. And then when I decided to go independent, I started an editorial group called The Writer's Ally, where we get to work with lots of authors on their manuscripts. But it's really important to me, since I am a writer, to also have that other side. You talked about the inner editor, and you can imagine my inner editor is on steroids because it's what I do for a living. So the first time I did NaNoWriMo, I was with a friend, and I'll admit this, it's a little embarrassing now, but it was actually October 31st. And I was sharing with her how much I was struggling with my creative work that I had, editing, and I was working on other people's books during the day, and to be able to switch gears and sort of create and work on my fiction in the evening or other times. And she told me about NaNoWriMo, and she said, I think this would be great for you. You have to force your inner editor to shut up because you only have so much time and you have to turn out all these words. So here we were, October 31st, we decided to start NaNoWriMo the next day. And as you can imagine, or maybe you can't imagine, I don't know, maybe you were more successful, but because I was so unprepared and I had never done it before, I think I got to about 10, 15,000 words before I sort of petered out, because I didn't even have a strong idea. I was just kind of writing for the sake of it, but I was hooked and I loved it. So the following 2 years, I tried it again with a little more preparation and a little more planning. To answer your question, I'm definitely a planner, not a pantser. Pantsing does not work well for me. So when I had a little more time to think through, at least loosely, what I wanted to write about and what my story would be, and sort of what characters I wanted to play with, I was able to actually win at NaNoWriMo the next 2 years, which was really awesome and exciting. And I just fell in love with the entire concept. I think it's a wonderful tool for a lot of different reasons.
I love that you signed up on October 31st. You're not the only one who's done that, by the way. I think we've had people sign up even in the last week of November, and they've even won. So it's possible.
Wow.
But to your point, though, I think most people, with a little bit of planning, it helps them succeed. That's wonderful. You got 10 or 15,000 words that first year, though. Yeah. Well, I'm curious if you can kind of travel back into your NaNoWriMo experiences and what it was like when you actually opened up that document. I mean, I find that very intimidating personally, because I'm just so worried that it's just going to be so dispiriting to look at my prose. And even though I've done it numerous times and found that that's not the case at all. So what happens when if you open up your Word doc or whatever software you're using, and it just looks too messy to deal with?
Yeah, well, I will say that I think you're absolutely right. So often we expect it's going to be so much worse than it is. I was also very pleasantly surprised when I gave myself about a week. I let it sit, and then I came back to it and I thought, oh my gosh, I wonder how much of this I'm going to have to cut out. Hopefully there'll be something salvageable in here. I did still like the idea. And actually, there was a lot of writing in there that was actually pretty good. There were some scenes I really liked. There was some dialogue I really liked. So, the first thing I would just say to everybody is to just own that, right? NaNoWriMo is a crazy, mind-bending experience. It's a rush, and a lot of us end up with a draft that can be really messy, and that's totally okay, and it's totally normal. And even though you might feel intimidated by it, I would just, sort of put that in the context of that's how it is for most of us, even those of us who have done it before, and even who have some professional experience with books. It didn't make my draft any less crazy when I did it.
We're all first-time novelists. Every novel we embark on is a first novel. We're learning how to write it as we go along. And I think you're right, about the gems. I mean, we say that quantity can lead to quality. I feel like that whole write with abandon approach, you're taking creative risks and you're opening different doors to different plot lines. And so I think, we need to reassure ourselves that there's a lot of good things there. It's just a rough draft like any rough draft, and it can be cleaned up and polished. And what I forgot to show during my intro, I was like, look, here's some novels that started out as really rough drafts during NaNoWriMo. Wool by Hugh Howey, huge bestseller. Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell, huge bestseller. Water for Elephants, made into a movie with Reese Witherspoon. Cinder by Marissa Meyer. We have a whole long list of best-selling novels that started as messy first drafts, and then they were revised. So tell us a little bit about what your vision approach is, or just some tips that you would recommend to people when they first open up their stories. How should they start?
Yeah. Well, I think the very first thing is to just carve out some space to just read the whole thing. I mean, start to finish, just kind of Read what you have, see what's there on the page, see what still resonates for you, as you're reading it, especially if you can give yourself a little distance first. So, now it's the end of January. If you haven't looked at your draft since the end of November, now's a great time to dive back into it. You have some fresh eyes, you have some objectivity. And I think you'd probably be surprised that you find a lot in there that you still really like and that gets you really excited. So start there, read through the whole thing. I would say don't edit, right? Just read, kind of orient yourself with what you have. Make notes, as you go. If ideas occur to you, or if you see things you definitely want to keep, or things that you can lose, like that's okay. But I wouldn't start immediately going into edit. I would just read through, assess where you're at and what you have. And then if you haven't already, if you're not a planner like I am, if you prefer to be a pantser or to write into the dark, as some writers say, I would encourage you to create an outline. And sometimes I get wary looks when I say that, because people hear outline and they think of like eighth grade and, Roman numerals and like really, thesis statements and like really, really rigid things. It's not the kind of outline I'm talking about. Although if that works for you, that's cool. What I'm talking about is simply creating a document, whether it's a giant whiteboard in your room or something in a Word document online, doesn't matter. But basically, create an outline that sort of lists what's happening in the draft. Where does it start? Where does it go next? What scenes are happening? What major moments are happening in the book? Major turning points, major emotional moments. Certainly, hopefully there's a climax in there somewhere. Where does that happen? What happens around it? And then, of course, what happens afterwards to help you wrap up the book. So create an outline, sort of a roadmap, if you will, of what you actually have in the draft, just as a place to get your bearings. And I think that exercise, especially if you didn't do one to start, can be a really great way to get your head around sort of where the gaps in your plot structure might be.
That's great. I actually love outlining after writing the rough draft. I tend to pants or plants the rough draft. I find that writing an outline or planning it ahead, if I plan the novel, I feel like I've already written it and it loses its mystery for me, at least.
Yeah.
So anyway, try to find a happy middle ground, but I love that exercise of then outlining it afterwards. And I appreciate you saying get rid of the Roman numerals. I think we all learned that outlining structure, and those Roman numerals don't do me a whole lot of good anymore. But getting some kind of sketch and feel for structure helps a lot. But I am curious, because I do this because plotting is not my strong suit, and actually on the topic of planning, I recently heard that James Patterson writes like a 20-page highly detailed outline before he even starts with the rough draft.
Yeah, I've read that too.
So do you recommend, like, after this first read, people have luxuriated, read their novel, gotten a kind of handle on what works and what doesn't, what the gaps might be? Should you do like a really detailed outline like that, where you're tracking the beats and the rising tension, really mapping out the climax to make sure it appears at kind of the right moment in the novel? Or is that something for later when you drill down more?
Yeah. So there's a lot of rules, and people use a lot of shoulds when it comes to writing, and I'm not an exception. I certainly have my preferred maxims, if you will. But I think one of the most important things you do as a writer is figuring out what works best for you. And what that really means is experimenting. So again, if you're somebody who's adamantly opposed to outlines, you're exactly the kind of person who really should do an outline, because you should just see. You should just see what it does for you. And if you normally write a very detailed 20-page, almost, a mini version of the book, maybe try pantsing it once. So that's just a sort of a side thing that I would say. But as far as actually fleshing it out and how detailed you want to get, I think for beginning writers, it's very helpful, because you can start to see in a very real way how different plot structures and storytelling techniques express themselves in that sort of roadmap form, or that skeleton, right? So you can think of a book, there's lots of metaphors we can play with, but you can think of a book plot as your skeleton. right? The bones of your story. And then, of course, all the things that you hang on the bones, you flesh out your book. So the characters and the scenes and the dialogue and the description. So sometimes it can be really hard to see those bones in a NaNoWriMo draft because there's so much other stuff going on. So the more detailed you can get, if you, start with a really, really bare skeleton and then take some time to just sort of take a breather from the draft itself, right? Think through both what you already have and where you might go with it. Now that you can sort of see, well, I wrote 50,000 words and nothing really exciting happens until, 18,032. That's problematic for a novel, right? You can't wait that long to have something exciting happen in a novel. So now you can see that in your outline. You can start to think, okay, well, what kind of plot beats? You use that term. That's a really common phrase that writers should get familiar with. What plot beats might I want to now go back and imagine and think through that would help me get to that big, really exciting thing that happens at 18,032 words.
I love the 18,332 word mark. If nothing has happened by then, you have to have a really patient reader. That's probably what, I don't know, it's at least 50 pages or more. But I'm curious, so that brings up, you mentioned that there are a lot of shoulds out there. And, I guess one thing a writer should do is to decide if you're going to follow those shoulds or not, or which ones you're going to follow. But I do think unless you really are writing a huge ponderous saga and you're relying on your readers having a lot of patience, you got to get the story going a lot earlier, right? So what would be like like when should you have the conflict or the character's need or want defined? Do you need that done on the first page? Can you give it 10 pages? That's a kind of a very important beat.
That is very important.
The inciting incident, right?
The inciting incident. Well, the inciting incident's a little different from what a character wants
True.
and needs, right? So what a character wants and needs often either leads to the inciting incident or sometimes is triggered by the inciting incident. So just to define that for everybody, the inciting incident is a phrase that we use to refer to basically the thing that happens in your story that sets the character, your protagonist, off on their journey, the thing that starts the story. So there's a lot of different theories around that. And there's a book that I highly recommend called Hooked by Les Edgerton, where he goes into detail of a number of different ways to approach an opening. So the inciting incident should happen very early in the novel, for sure. It doesn't have to happen on the very first page, but it definitely shouldn't happen at 18,032 words. It's got to happen somewhere fairly close to the beginning of the book. And you have a little bit of leeway there depending on the genre. There are different expectations. For example, if you read mystery thrillers, you'll notice that the murder always happens either in a prologue or the first chapter. It's a rule of the genre, and that's your inciting incident. Someone gets murdered, now there's an investigation. So if you're writing a mystery thriller, it has to happen in a prologue or the first chapter. If you're writing a literary novel or even a fantasy novel, something that is a little long, can be a little longer, where readers are accustomed to spending a little more time with world building and a little more time with characters. It's not necessarily as dependent on a fast-paced plot. Then you can have a little bit more time to build up to that inciting incident. Although what happens before it in those very first pages is still always really, really important because, of course, you need to hook your reader.
That's great. One of the pieces of revision advice that I really appreciate, it always really works for me once I get there. I'm horrible about, I guess, embracing it, is I think it was William Faulkner who said this quote that a writer has to kill his or her darlings, kill your darlings. And I think, when you talked about reading through your novel, that in that first pass and even later passes for me, is I'll spot those darlings. And it's this irony. What that phrase "kill your darlings" means is that it's something that means a lot to the writer, but it impedes the story. And so it doesn't mean a lot to the reader necessarily. And once you identify one of those darlings, what I do is I try to do everything I can to try to make it work, draft after draft, even though I know it's just not working. I'm so attached to it. That's why it's called a darling. And then finally, once I cut it, it's just like this big sigh of relief. It all works better as a result, almost always. But there is a question. I mean, I just do it by feel. How do people recognize their darlings?
That is a really good question. And of course, it is so important, as you said, because when you're reading through something and you're really close to it and you're emotionally involved in it, it can be very difficult to gain objectivity, which of course is one of the reasons why people work with folks like me and people on my team with freelance editors, or writers critique groups or writing partners. There's lots of different ways to get that feedback. But, I think part of it is simply recognizing that urge. Like when you're starting to revise, let's say you're going through that outline exercise we talked about earlier. If you start to notice that you have this scene or this subplot or even a character that isn't really fitting in, and you start to find yourself trying to make it fit in, that's one clue that you might have a darling there that needs to go. Not necessarily, sometimes it's just about figuring out to make it work. But I think probably the biggest red flag is simply asking yourself, which is also a really important part of the revision process, a little further, not necessarily the first step, but as you start, working those pieces together, does this really need to be here? Is this scene really crucial to the reader's understanding or to the building tension, or, depending on the kind of story you're trying to tell? Is this character really necessary? Is even a detail sometimes, we think of details as being dressing and color, and it's true that it is, but there's also a really important economy of words that has to go on. You want your readers only to be reading the most essential. Otherwise, they're getting distracted by stuff that you may have really loved, but if it doesn't really need to be there, they're going to sense that more than you probably do. And it might derail them, it might confuse them, it might bore them. That happens sometimes too, if there's a big old scene or a big old subplot that's taking away from what otherwise might be a really gripping or engaging story pace. That can be really problematic. So I think that it's really important for writers to understand, or maybe not to understand, but to come to a place where they can accept that when you make the shift from writing for yourself, which NaNoWriMo is totally all about, and which is an awesome thing, if you decide that you want to start sharing your work with an audience, that you want to publish that work in some form, you have to remember at that point, you're making a really important transition. You're not writing for yourself anymore. You're writing for your readers. You're writing for an audience. And ultimately, people don't buy books because of what you want to tell them or what you want to say to them. They buy it because of what they want, right? It's not about you. It's about them.
It is. You're serving your reader. And while you were saying that, I was remembering a story with my editor. He flagged some kind of excessive. I was being excessively wordy, using all these whatever big multisyllabic words, and he said that's too much. And I kind of fought back for some reason. I was like, no, I want them. And then I read that section after the book was published and was like, oh my gosh, he was so right. This should have all been cut. So that brings up the next question. Writing can be a lonely experience. Revising can be a lonely experience. What are your recommendations for people in terms of how to find good beta readers, which is super difficult, especially for novels. If you have to find somebody to read the novel from start to finish, I'm constantly searching for good beta readers. And then, like at what stage would you recommend people seek feedback? I mean, I know that's a highly personal thing. I'm one of those writers who doesn't seek feedback until almost the very end. I have to revise a draft numerous times before I'm comfortable getting feedback. But some people I know, as the pages come off the printer, they hand them to a friend.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is another place where you have to think about and experiment a little with what works best for you. But I would say, generally speaking, especially for beginning authors, that you definitely want to spend some time with that draft yourself first. I wouldn't just finish Nano and hand it off to somebody, right? They're going to read it. It's going to be crazy. That's a really big ask for somebody, even somebody who loves you very much, to read 50,000 words of something that's completely unrevised and really stream of consciousness. So I definitely think that you want to spend some time working on it, looking at your structure, making sure that your concept is really clear. Sometimes depending on how you approach Nano, you might not yet be 100% sure what your story is even about, right? That may have been what the experience was for you, like figuring that out as you go, especially if you're a pantser. So, get really clear on what your story is about, what story you're trying to tell. We talk about things like a sales handle or an elevator pitch, right? So that being able to describe your book in like a sentence or two, really, really, really short. So if you can do that, and it doesn't have to be perfect at this stage, but being able to know enough of what story you're telling to describe it in like a line or two, that's going to really guide your revision process. It's going to be a really important touchstone. And it also is really helpful when you do start sharing your work with others, because if you don't really know what you're trying to do, you can't expect them to give you feedback that's really helpful. They have no context for what it is that they're reading, for where it is that you're trying to go, especially in early stages. Sometimes that's not as obvious in a draft as it should be. So definitely best results. I call it a solid first draft stage, which means, if Nano is super, super raw, and then let's imagine a revised draft is a rough draft after that. So the first time you go through and kind of start to make sense of everything, and then spend some time on it, polish it a little bit, get the things that you notice, get the things that are obvious, where you totally forgot something, or where a plot point goes completely awry and doesn't make any sense. You don't want to waste people's time. And it's about respect a little bit, but also simply about how fresh their eyes are. If you are giving your work to, let's say, a critique group, and I'm a big fan of critique groups, by the way. I highly, highly recommend that writers join or even form a writers group so that they can share their work with other writers and get that feedback and have that common vocabulary and help each other with their work. If you do that and you're giving them stuff too early, by the time you're ready to give them something that's a little bit more advanced, where you could really, really use their help because you've kind of used up all your own objectivity, you need those fresh eyes, they're not fresh anymore because they've already seen your draft, 4 times. So I think for that reason as well, that you can definitely give your stuff to somebody a little too early. And just the last point that I would add to that, again, especially for new writers, there's a very real, emotional ego component to writing a book. And when you're writing something and you're really excited about it, or even if you're really afraid, maybe you think it really sucks and you don't know, if you give that work to somebody a little too early, where it's not quite yet approaching something that resembles a book, um, they might be well-intentioned, it might be an accident, but they might say something that hurts your feelings or makes you feel really nervous or makes you feel like, oh, don't quit your day job kind of a thing. And, even though over time it's really important to build a thick skin as a writer, when you're first starting out, it'd be really sad for your entire project to get put into a drawer simply because one person saw a very early, very rough draft and said something that made you think that you suck.
Very good advice, Sally. I love it. We're on the same trajectory too. I define my NaNoWriMo rough draft as kind of a zero draft, where I'm searching for the story, and then after I revise that draft, that becomes my first draft, so to speak. Well, I know that you have a NaNoWriMo manuscript or a portion of one, an excerpt to run through AutoCrit and show us how it works. And I know we have Kevin from AutoCrit who's even going to go deeper and show us how this fantastic online tool works. So I'm going to hand it over to you guys to give us a little demo.
Yeah, so I have a little information about that before we bring that up. So we're going to do sort of a little overall walkthrough process of self-editing in AutoCrit. And we're going to be using a 2018 NaNoWriMo draft from Katze Touré and her draft of her story, I Don't Know What I'm Doing, which is kind of funny. I don't know if that was actually her title or if she was just being
a little tongue-in-cheek. I laughed when I saw that, yeah. And feel free to introduce your cat who is with you also. I think we haven't spoken enough about the value of pets in revision. We'll do a special pets in revision webcast later.
Yes, I do. I don't know if you've heard him chirp a few times. My cat, I have 4 actually. My cat Donner, my writing buddy, he's lounging here on my desk just beneath the monitor. Here's his tail. So I Don't Know What I'm Doing is about 2 sisters living together after their parents have died. And their parents had plans to start an animal rescue, which the two sisters are trying to continue with and keep up in their memory. The oldest sister is a stripper who's just now going back to school, so she's struggling with some issues around that. And the younger sister is a senior in high school, and she's struggling with some her own sexuality. So I want to give a little bit of context for this before we dive in. First, that the strength of your novel really relies on basically two aspects. The writing itself, which is sort of like the technical or line level aspect of writing a book. And then you have the execution of the concept, which I like to call the big picture level. So if the former is a disaster, then the concept's not going to come across at its best, right? It might be confusing. It might be weakly portrayed. If your basic writing on the line level is really confusing, bad grammar, things like that, then it might distract or frustrate or even bore the reader so much that they don't even care about the concept anymore. So AutoCrit is a tool that deals better with the technical level than any other, in my opinion. It's very important to help you up-level those basic writing skills that are really crucial for helping those concept ideas shine through. But the big picture level is where your editor comes in. And, maybe one day artificial intelligence, but as of right now, there's no software yet developed that can really address those big picture issues. So not only do you want to prevent your basic writing skill from keeping your readers at arm's length, you also want to deal with that before you work with an editor. Because just like any reader, if your forest can't see the forest for the trees, they can't engage with your ideas. And, basically what that means to do their best work, which if you're working with a freelancer you're paying for, to do the work where you really need them to, you want to remove any obstacles that your writing will present. You don't want to spend a lot of money for a professional to tell you things that AutoCrit could have told you for a lot less money. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Kevin.
All right, thanks, Ally. Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin, and I've been in product development and training for AutoCrit for the past 6 years. So you can say I know the ins and outs of the system and the reasoning behind its recommendations. Before I go jumping into the file, I'd love to give a little background about how the service actually works, because it's kind of important to understand the basis behind all the AutoCrit recommendations and algorithms. They're really based on the research we've done on categorizing millions of published works of fiction and using machine learning to analyze the information and create a benchmark down to the word level of what we're seeing in more than 20 different areas of the writing. We cover things that we talked about earlier in this webinar, and we also point out, those where the dreaded boring sections are, where there's too much backstory, not enough action. We use it, or use the same words over and over again, and you can't seem to find out where that repetition is. We highlight these areas too, so that you can take a look through in the lens of an editor, or even better, you can see through the eyes of a reader. We bake tons of these accepted writing rules right into our feedback and tailored it just for you. So without further delay, let's jump in and see how this author's draft stacks up and walk through a few key elements of the AutoCrit analysis. Now, keep in mind, this is just a brief review of the highlighting of several different interesting elements of this work. It's not a complete review of everything. So first off, there's two basic segments of AutoCrit. And let me switch over to share our screen so you could see. And I'll jump over to our AutoCrit system. There's two basic line item elements. One is the overall summary report, which you see here. Then there's also a line item specific reports that we run. But first, let's talk about the summary report. This is a great place to start. It gives you a more big picture perspective of what we're finding and can be used as a guide to go through and what to focus on during the self-editing process. Top of the page here, we have an overall score. Now, I get a lot of questions about this. No, this is not a grade. You didn't get an 87 here. This is really just a representation of the 25 plus areas of our analysis rolled up into a single number. And the less highlights and less things we've found, the higher this number will go. So we love using it as a benchmark. So if you start editing and you run this and you get a 75, hopefully after a couple of days or so, you check it again, it might be an 80 or an 85. So it's kind of a way to, it's just for people that love stats to kind of track your progress as you edit. Try to make it an interesting game out of it, perhaps, as you go through and try to improve and polish your work. So our summary report displays things in a lot of different ways. And one of them we really like to highlight here is our gauge. This gauge data is a comparison to published fiction. So in this case, we're in the good category. What this means is we've compared the text that we brought in from our sample from our webinar participant here. And we compared it to published fiction, and we found in this case adverbs were used at a good level, actually better than average. There were fewer adverbs found than is typically found in all the stuff we've analyzed and highlighted, our benchmark that we've established. Now, we're looking here at general fiction. If you wanted to compare to, say, something more in your specific genre, we have that ability here. Let's say romance, for example. I want to know how the number of adverbs I use compares to romance. So you just click on that, you rerun the report, and voila, you've now seen how many times you typically see that number of adverbs in a work of romance. And even more exciting now, we've just released this recently, is we've brought out authors. So not only can you see how many times you would use adverbs in your genre, you can also find out how many times Danielle Steele would have used adverbs in that amount of text based on, she obviously has a ton of books out there. We've analyzed them, we've compiled them, and we've created a benchmark for each one of these data points. And there you go. Now you can compare your work to what Danielle Steele would have had. So it's kind of fun, kind of interesting. That's part of the whole goal here at AutoCrit is, obviously giving you some framework to go by, but also try to make this fun, make it interesting. So with that, again, the summary report, I just want to follow up again. The summary report is really the roadmap to go through and check your progress as you go. Ally, do you have any thoughts on the summary report?
Yeah, absolutely. So revisions happen best in iterations, right? We were talking a little bit about a zero draft, as Grant said, or a rough draft or first draft. Every time that you do a round of revisions, what we call a pass in the editorial world, you want to be looking at a small subset of issues. You don't want to be trying to revise for every single possible thing that you could do to fix or improve your draft as you're going over each page. It's very overwhelming, and you just can't keep all of that in your head. It's just not a very effective way to revise. So keeping this in mind, when you first run that summary report, it might seem overwhelming. As Kevin said, there's something like 25 plus different ways, not to mention looking at other authors and genre and things like that. So, it may seem overwhelming, but what's awesome about AutoCrit is it makes it really easy to approach your revision in chunks. And we're going to see that in a minute. You just work through one report at a time, look to see which report has the biggest number of results to address, but also think in terms of a top-down approach. Deal with the biggest or most robust issues first. It's too easy to let yourself get distracted because it seems easier to correct spelling errors, for example, than it is to deal with cliches.
Thanks, Ally. Let's go ahead and dig into one of these reports. I like starting with dialogue myself. I don't know. It's just one of those areas that I think is critical to fiction is the dialogue. So AutoCrit actually has a whole course on how to write dialogue. But for this perspective, it's important to know that many agents and editors and publishers often look at a section of your dialogue first to get a feel for the quality of the writing. The purpose of this report here in AutoCrit is to identify the number and type of dialogue tags used. In this case, we had 114 dialogue tags other than said and asked, and 16 uses of the said and asked. Now, the whole goal here with a rule of thumb is that most people agree that sticking with said and asked is the way to go. And using creative dialogue tags is something to be wary of. So in this case, this raised a little bit of a red flag with regard to what's going on here. Why is there so many other use of dialogue tags? So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and run down and click on and run the specific dialogue tag report, and we'll jump in and we'll see the line item reporting inside of AutoCrit. So this is a typical line item report inside of AutoCrit where whatever we're looking for is on the right. In this case, it would be dialogue tags. And on the left is your text. And using this method is pretty simple. You just scroll down and you find something you want to look at. In this case, I highlighted this one here, gesticulated. Very creative dialogue tag. It kind of jumped out of off the page at me when I read it. I'm like, well, that's interesting. And unfortunately, that's not what you want to have happen with a dialogue tag, because complex or creative tags such as these can be a distraction to the reader and impact the flow of your story. The dialogue itself should be the thing that's creative, should be the thing that's driving it, and not the tag. Ally, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, everything that you said is totally true. You want those dialogue tags to almost disappear into the background. That's why said and asked generally is preferred in the industry, there's a really common pitfall here that a focus on reducing tags can help you avoid. And that pitfall is using tags that may not be logically sound. And this gesticulated is actually a really good example. So Katsy has this line of dialogue here. Zoe laughed with her, and then she has the dialogue. And you see here at the end of the dialogue, she gesticulated. Well, gesticulated means to basically like wave your hands around wildly. She didn't gesticulate that sentence, right? She said that sentence. She spoke that sentence. So using gesticulated as a dialogue tag here is actually illogical. There is no logical way to gesticulate that line of dialogue. Probably it should actually be a period to end the dialogue, and then a separate sentence would be she gesticulated to underscore, the joke that she's making in the dialogue itself. So this report can really help you zero in on where some of those little problems might be hiding.
Thanks, Ally. Let's jump back to the summary report here, and I want to jump over to another report we have, which is adverbs. We mentioned this earlier in the webinar here about the overall level of adverbs found is better than average. There's fewer than we typically find. However, one thing that AutoCrit also does is count each word that you've used that would be dropped into the category of adverb. So in this case, even though our overall use is well within reason, we find that we've overused a few of them. We have a couple of pet words you could say that we use often. In this case, it would be the word quickly. And so once again, we can click here and run the specific report and find out where those are at, and I'll jump to that. So I have all the adverbs turned off. You can obviously turn them all on or turn them all off here. I'll just highlight quickly, as that was the focus. And by just clicking on it inside of AutoCrit, it will zoom to every single location you've used that in your text. That fast. So the beauty about adverbs, well, for the most part, if you want to be quick about editing, you can just, get rid of them. Just go ahead and erase them out of your text. There's also, I'm sure there's also other ways of doing it. You can rewrite the whole sentence if you want, but if you want to be quick and dirty about it, you can just erase the adverb, because 9 times out of 10, it probably wasn't needed in the first place. Ally, do you have any other suggestions there with adverbs?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Kevin. Most of the time, adverbs are totally unnecessary, but there are some cases where this kind of report can help be a clue that points you in the direction of stronger writing in general. So as an example, the phrase ran quickly instead, I teach this trick where you replace weak adverbs with stronger nouns and verbs. So instead of ran quickly, you might use the verb sprinted. Right? It's one word, it's fewer words on the page, so you have more real estate for other good stuff, but also it's a much stronger word. You say sprinted, people know immediately what that means. It's a little more interesting than just ran quickly.
Thanks, Ally. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that one. There's so many people out there say get rid of adverbs, but sometimes there's a place for them, sometimes there's not. Let's jump back to the summary report and look at another interesting element of this writing. Under word choice, AutoCrit will also identify things such as a use of initial pronouns in names. In this case, we find that over 60% of all the sentences in this work contain an initial pronoun or a name. So I thought that's kind of high. Typically, it's usually 50% or less, depending on, I guess, the type of writing and whatnot. But as soon as I saw that, okay, let's take a look and see where that could become a problem. So I'll run that report again, the specific one. And a good example of how that become an issue showed up here in the third paragraph. In this case, every single sentence in this paragraph starts with she. She brushed her teeth. She skipped down the stairs. She grabbed eggs. She pulled down a few plates. Now, every once in a while, that's fine, but you get to the point where this becomes a repetitive sentence structure. And just like repeating words, repeating your sentence structure and how you start every sentence and how things happen, that can also bore your reader without you even knowing it. I mean, you might not even notice that when you're writing it, but as soon as you put in one of these AutoCrit reports and you highlight it, it just kind of jumps out of the page. And so, you know what? Maybe I should vary that up a little bit and try to make it more interesting. It's another way of keeping your reader engaged and hooked, is varying how your sentences start. So let me go ahead and switch on now to probably my last thing I'm going to do on this demo would be the repetition area inside of AutoCrit. Now, this is one of my most favorite areas in AutoCrit. It's truly amazing how well computers can find repetition, better than the humans could possibly do. It's just what they do best, right? They count things. So oftentimes, especially when writing drafts quickly, aka NaNoWriMo, we use a handful of words and phrases and we just throw them together in different patterns. So our vocabulary is actually fairly limited, especially when we're trying to just get as much down on paper as possible. And we end up using the same words and phrases and cliches and everything else over and over and over again. And it's kind of hard to see that, but the computer is excellent at counting that out and finding that for you. So for example, I ran a repetition report here, and this report identifies the use of the same word close together in your text. So if I were to select all of them, you'll see there's a lot of words that have been used a bunch of times. But for example, I can just zoom in on jumped. So here we have somebody jumped out of bed and then two cats jumped onto the bed. Well, not a big deal, really. It's just jumped, but you'll see the point that these two words are exactly the same, used close together. And once again, that's a thing about varying your sentence structure. Well, you got to vary your words as well to try to keep it interesting. Maybe use a different form of description of such an act. In addition to finding things that are close together, repetition that's close together, AutoCrit also counts all the words you've used, right? So we can tell you how many times you've used it throughout the entire work. And that comes into our frequency categories. And I think it's fun to not only look at word frequency, but phrase frequency. So I jumped on that. Let me switch over to phrase frequency. So just like we looked at the specific words that were used, in this case, let's look at the phrases. So these are 3-word phrases that have been repeated over and over in this text. And rolled her eyes is used 7 times. And here's another, oh my God, has been used 7 times as well. So if you click on this, it just kind of zooms to these locations, and you'll see scrolling down the repeated use of the same phrase over and over and over again. And if it's your pet phrase and you like it, you might not even notice that you have it, but the computer here is completely impartial. It will highlight it and be fearless. It'll just show it to you. You can't deny that you've used, oh my God, like 4 times right in a row there. So it kind of jumps out at you. And that's one of the, obviously one of the really exceptional things that AutoCrit can do for you and help you clean up and polish your work ahead of time, which is what we really, our focus here is to help you out with that in that regard. I think. Sorry, Ally, do you have any other thoughts on this before we move on?
Oh, good. Yeah, there you are, Kevin. I thought we lost you for a second.
Sorry, my microphone cut out all of a sudden. No big deal.
Yeah, no problem. So remember what I said earlier about tackling your revisions from a top-down perspective? This is a really great example, this repetition of words report, of why that's really helpful. So imagine you've already worked through reports like the adverb report or the dialogue tags. By the time you get to the report and repetition, you're going to see that number of repeated words probably cut in half, maybe even more, which ultimately means less work for you. However, if you start with repetition, maybe because it seems easier, you probably will find that the changes you make to mix up your words simply to avoid repetition still doesn't address the issues found in other reports or aspects of your draft. So you're not making more work for yourself, but you're not reducing your work either in the way that you would have if you did that sort of, more substantive issues first.
Perfect. Thanks, Ally. Once again, obviously we can't cover everything here, but I hope this gives you a glimpse into how AutoCrit can be a powerful partner in helping you clean and polish your work. We really want to help you in this, and not only do we want to help you polish your work, most importantly, I think we want to have people have fun. Try to bring editing back to the fun side. I know it's hard to say, but editing can be fun, and tools like this, we hope that make interesting and kind of help spice it up a bit. So with that, I think that's about the end of the review on the AutoCrit side of things. Ally, would you want to share a few more thoughts about CATSI's opening and what authors should be looking for in their own opening pages?
Yeah, sure. So you can see from, even this brief demo, which really just scratches the surface of what AutoCrit can do for you. But you can see how it helps you improve the writing on a line-by-line basis, like we talked about earlier, that technical level of the writing itself. So, I just want to mention a couple of things that an editor would add to this process. So for example, in the opening pages, actually, can you bring that up, Kevin? Maybe our first page there. There we go. So In the very first few pages of this particular draft, there's a lot of exposition. There's very little scene setting. There's not a lot of language or action happening that has emotional resonance. And those are the kinds of things that can make it difficult for a reader to engage with your protagonist. So remember, we talked earlier, Grant and I, about how important it is to hook a reader pretty much right away, even though there's a number of different ways to do that. One way or another, you want that reader to be engaged. If they're thinking, I don't know where this is going and I don't really care, by the time they get to the bottom of even the first page, you may have lost them. It's certainly true if you're submitting to agents and publishers, but even with regular, with readers, if you're self-publishing or you're sharing with a critique group or anyhow, people don't have a lot of patience these days. So if they're not engaging with the protagonist, we definitely don't want that. It's also a little bit unclear whose story this is or what kind of story it is. So we start off, as I mentioned, there are two sisters in this story. We start off in Dina's point of view, but we move very quickly to Lena's point of view. Whose story is this going to be? Now, of course, I told you that it's the story of both sisters, but from the beginning, that's not really clear. So all of this is to say, this may not be the best place to begin the story. And how do you know where to start your story, right? I also mentioned, I made that joke earlier about you don't want the first exciting thing to happen 18,000 words into the draft. So an editor can help you identify, first of all, that where you've chosen to start the story may not be the most engaging place, and help reassure you that the material you have in the very beginning of your draft either doesn't need to be there, right? It might be a darling, or it might simply be you as a writer easing yourself into the story. Sometimes we write because we need to get to a certain place mentally, but that doesn't mean the reader needs it. It may not need to be on the page at all. Or there might be material there like backstory that can be moved to a slightly later spot in the novel and still convey certain information or have a really important effect, but it doesn't have to happen right in the beginning. So thinking about the opening of your story, just a couple of quick tips. We talked about inciting incident. What is the big thing that sets your characters off on their journey? Also think in terms of practicality. What do readers need to know right now to understand that inciting incident? What do they actually need to know what the hell is going on in the first few pages of your book? Whose story is this? Which point of view do you want to start in? What tone do you want to set? You're going to start a romance novel very differently than you might start a mystery thriller. Like I mentioned, you're not going to start a romance with somebody's murder, right? That's a very different kind of tone. And again, I'll plug that book by Les Edgerton. I don't even know the guy. I just think it's such a fantastic book, and it's very, very narrowly focused. It's called Hooked on Openings, which can be so tricky to get right and are absolutely crucial. So I definitely encourage everybody to check that out.
Cool. Thanks, Ally. Back to, I guess, our final here, our giveaway announcement. We really appreciate the opportunity to partner with NaNoWriMo and Ally and to share our mission with all you. To celebrate, we wanted to run a contest, give away free AutoCrit memberships to lucky participants on this webinar. Check out the contest page to see what we're giving away and enter to win. And I'll go ahead and throw that image back up on here for you guys. I'll share it if it's not already in the chat box there. Here it is right there. It's www.autocrit.com/NaNoWriMo. And with that, Grant, I'll get back to you for having any follow-up questions from the audience.
Thanks so much, Kevin. That was great. And thanks, Ally. Yeah, we do have some questions. We've got about, 7 or so minutes. So hopefully we can hit them. Marilyn Williams asks, this is something I'm going to talk a little bit about because I feel like she hits a key revision point on the head. She says, do I print it, her manuscript out and edit it, or do I go online? And of course, it's a matter of preference, but I want to hear your take, Ally. But I always print out my manuscript because I feel like you need to set up an environment for objectivity. And the more I can get away from my computer, the more objective my mind is. And so I like to put myself in the place that a normal reader is. And sometimes I even go out of the house with my manuscript and read it in a cafe. And I think it's also interesting to think about how the pace you read it at. I usually try to read mine in a day or two just to kind of get all my thoughts together all at once. But sometimes I wonder if I should stretch it out like I would a normal novel and read a chapter or two a day. But anyway, that's what I recommend. How about you, Ally? What's your answer to that question?
Yeah, I think all of that is very true and very important. So there's a very real thing that happens. your brain actually will process words differently depending on how it receives them. So when you're reading something on a screen and then you print it out and you read it on the page, your brain will literally, different parts of your brain will be activated. So that means you will notice things and you will respond to things differently when you're looking at it on a piece of paper versus looking at it on a screen. Sometimes people will also read out loud to themselves or record themselves reading and then listen to it for the very same reason. So I absolutely encourage, if not at first, then at some point during the revision process, yeah, print it out for sure.
Yeah, I've even heard about some writers, they will print it out and they'll put it in a different font from what
Yeah.
they wrote it in, because that just gives them that extra little layer of objectivity. And I love reading it out loud too. That's a great tip. Kevin, Zara writes, she's picking up on your theme of how can editing be made fun, and I think I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I think, as anguishing as writing a rough draft might be, or as difficult as it might be, we really emphasize fun during NaNoWriMo, and that goes for revision too. It doesn't need to be this horrendous process of self-doubt and beating yourself up. In fact, I sometimes like it more than the rough draft itself. But anyway, let's other than using those fun features of AutoCrit, Ally, how can you make editing fun? Can you do it?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of it is mindset. For me, I really like the revision process. I mean, naturally, I'm an editor, so I better like that process. But I think of it as solving a puzzle. It's figuring out how the pieces work together the best way, or what pieces are missing that you need to then put in. So it just feels very, it feels very tactile to me. It feels very much like you are playing, and you can free yourself. I think you should free yourself up to play. Try organizing your scenes in one particular type of structure. Maybe mix some things up and have them happen in a different order and see how that feels and how that flows. If you have one character serving a certain purpose, maybe consider if there's a different character that could serve that purpose. There's no reason to feel like once you've drafted something, your revision process is, very rigidly about trying to make that specific version of your vision work. You can totally have some fun with it and experiment. And sometimes you'll find out some really cool things you might never have thought about otherwise.
Yeah, I think having fun and being playful and experimenting is just as crucial to the revision process as it is to the drafting process. Really, I think it's like when you burrow in with a really kind of narrow, when you put on the blinders, that's when your story can ossify, and when you're just kind of beating your head against the wall trying to make something work that maybe won't work. So yeah, definitely figure out ways to make it fun, and yeah, it can be fun. So that's a great question. We've got just a couple minutes here. Let's see if we have any more questions here. Well, Chris Hall asks a good question, and I don't know that there's a true answer to this, but as someone who I have spent years editing a novel, and sometimes I wonder if I spent too much time. I should have just given it up. But Chris asks, how long should the editing process be in general?
Yeah, there's definitely no right answer to that. I mean, it's really going to depend on a lot of factors. If you, I was at a conference just this weekend and I spoke to a gentleman who has written and published 37 novels. 37, and he basically described his process as outlining the book, sitting down, writing the book, sending it to his editor, making changes based on what the editor says, and then sending it to the publisher. Like, that's it. But he's written 37 books, so he's internalized a lot of the type of stuff that our newer writers listening aren't going to be able to do. So, I would say don't rush it. Don't feel pressured. Try to take, if there's any kind of pressure, sometimes people will place arbitrary deadlines on themselves, like they want to have something done by their birthday or by the end of the year or something like that. Try to take all that stuff away and just engage with the work itself, and edit it, till it's really working. And if you start to feel like you're just futzing with it for the sake of futzing, then it's time to let it go and let someone else read it if you haven't already, because there is such a thing as over futzing.
Definitely, and that definitely applies to revision. Since you brought up the kind of goal deadline framework that we use for writing a rough draft, we actually have a function on our website. They're called goal trackers, and you can put in a revision goal as well. You can say, I'm going to revise for 100 hours, say, in the next 3 months. and I still believe in that a goal and a deadline is a creative midwife. How do you feel about that? Does that reduce or kind of minimize the capacity for play?
Well, I don't think that it reduces the capacity for play. And in that context, I definitely agree. I am a fan of deadlines. So let me just like add that caveat. It's not that deadlines aren't good. It's more that if it's not serving a productive purpose, like your example is a great example of how a deadline can help. You're committing to doing a certain amount of work within a time frame, and that can be motivating. That can help you, do that proverbial butt in chair, right? The work doesn't get done if you don't show up to do the work, to loosely paraphrase Stephen Pressfield, who's one of my idols. But, pushing yourself to get something done by your birthday because you just feel like you have to be done by your birthday, that's a little bit less helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I do think, though, the revision process, can be this sprawling, lifelong pursuit, and I think a deadline can just help you like focus on it a little bit more.
Definitely.
Well, we're here at the 5 o'clock, or 5 o'clock for me, Mark. So we're at the hour. Do you have any like one bit of revision advice that we didn't touch on that you'd love to send people off with to help them, get through that draft?
I think that it's good to have that attitude of play and experimentation and not let your work get too precious. That idea of darlings can be a really big stumbling block sometimes, and it's not even necessarily just about a paragraph or a character. Sometimes it can be about a whole concept, and people can be really, really wedded to whatever their original vision of the book was. When in fact, I think especially if you do nano, you learn pretty quickly that stories can have a life of their own, and characters can have a life of their own. And as author, you want to wrangle that, but you can't control it too rigidly. If you try to, then you end up with something that feels very forced, and inorganic. And that's the exact opposite, I think, of what we all want to read in a novel.
Perfect. I love that. Thank you so much, Ally. Thank you, AutoCrit, for sponsoring this. Thank you, Kevin, for that demo. Please go to the AutoCrit page and check out all the details to win some free time with AutoCrit. So thanks again, everybody. Happy revising.
Thanks,
and
Grant.
writing.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
guys.
Be playful, whimsical. All right. Thanks, everyone.